Hey there, Wargamers, Justin here, Paint here, and today I want to talk about deployment in Battletech Alpha Strike. I'd like to thank you guys for tuning in today. Thank you for coming back to the channel. If you're new here, though, be sure to hit that like, subscribe, sound off in the comments below if there's questions about what I'm talking about or things you would like to see. With that being said, let's get into today's discussion. Now, if you have been following some of the videos recently that I put out, one of them was talking about threat projection. So some of what we're going to talk about today is going to be a rehash of that a little bit. But in today's video, I want to talk about deployment considerations in Battletech Alpha Strike. So what do I mean by deployment considerations? That's all-encompassing for all of the things that go through my brain when I want to set up my models during a game of Battletech Alpha Strike. Now, I would preface this by saying that these ideas, these thoughts, they cross a multitude of game systems. A lot of my views and my philosophies come from a 40K background. The thing that makes these better, in my opinion, is that in Battletech Alpha Strike, it is not a you go, I go system, in that in 40K, if I go first and I have superior deployment, superior table side, vantage points on you, and I go first, I get to move first, I get to push objectives first, I get to shoot at you first, and if I'm able to take some of your material off the table, then on your first turn, you're playing a, 1,850 point game of 40K, but you're playing with 1,500 points, because I've taken something off before you even got to go. So in Battletech Alpha Strike and Classic, you and I alternate moving and shooting, and things will always get to return fire. In general, there's a few things that break that, like formations and stuff like that. But in general, a unit that goes down, if it has targets, will get to fire before it's removed from play. So deployment in Battletech, Alpha Strike in particular, the turn 1 leaf blow stuff that you have to worry about with 40K is not present here. So what do I mean by leaf blowing? That means that your list sets up and your opponent blows you off the table on turn 1 before you get to go. And 40K, that's generally going to be manifested by one player, player 2 generally. If they fail to seize initiative and they've planned for that, they've deployed all their stuff as best they can behind terrain so they cannot be shot on turn 1. That's boring. And that's not something that comes up in Battletech or Battletech Alpha Strike. Generally, if you position something not to be shot, it's after turn 1. Because on turn 1 of the game, you will get to move before you're shot at, generally. And if you feel as though you need to be behind a building during that movement phase, after you've seen your opponent start to go and you're alternating, then you do so. But you can deploy all your stuff out in the open, doesn't matter on the first turn, because you will get to move, if that makes sense. So, when I go to deploy units, the first thing that I look at when I approach the table is, what's the terrain layout? What are the vantage points? Is there any specific advantage to a piece of terrain, a feature that I want? For example, if you're running a lot of units that have overheat, and there's a water feature on the table, you can use that to your advantage, being able to overheat and clear some of that heat with the water. That's important. Is that water feature going to help you push the objectives, though? If getting it helps that unit, but that unit can't help you win the game, ignore that feature. It doesn't matter. A secondary consideration, much like a water feature, is trees. Is there a position on the table with like a wooded area that you could secure, you could push, you could take, and try and deny your opponent to give you the edge for the cover, basically, and allow you to overwatch or project your fire onto the table? If there are trees off in a corner somewhere, and units in there would have a defensive position, but they can't actually bring their guns to bear on any objectives that are relevant, those trees are pointless to you. Don't do that. So the first thing that I do is try to identify, are there areas on the table that are important, that I can take, that are advantageous? If the water is advantageous to the trees, but I can't get to it, and my opponent can, ignore it. There's no reason to fight for that. If there are trees on this side of the table, or water on this side of the table, and you can't get to it and your opponent can, don't bite into that. Don't fight into it if you don't have to. So that brings me into the second consideration. Once you identified the terrain, and let me back up. When I set up for a tournament, I try and, as best as possible, make my tables to where that they're relatively mirrored, so that in 40K I've had instances where if you ended up having to, or if your opponent ended up getting to pick the table side, you can kind of get screwed because it's that skewed, right? And no one wants that. So when I do a tournament, I try and make the tables as best I can, as balanced as possible, so no matter where you get placed on that setup, it should be a reasonably balanced game. I don't want it to be super skewed. There are times where a building or a terrain feature might be slightly more on one side or the other. That's okay, but I don't want it so skewed that, like, if you get that side, you win, right? So, back to point number 2. You've identified the terrain features. You've ideally set or picked your deployment side. What's the second thing? objectives. What are you doing? And this whole conversation about deployment hinges on the assumption that you guys are playing more than just stand-up fight. If you are not playing gameplay setups that encompass more than just a stand-up fight, you're missing out on everything that Battletech Alpha Strike has to offer. There's a certain advantage to certain units and certain builds when you know that you're going in and you're only going to shoot your opponent. Like that, there's certain lists that do well with that. But in everyday or in a standard like battle, like a war, a campaign, you're going to secure an HPG. You need to disrupt supply lines. You need to come secure this the strategic point because it's going to disrupt your opponent's communications, or you're going to break their lines so they can't get reinforcements, things of that nature. It's not just my trench, your trench, we artillery, shoot each other. That gets boring. Occasionally a stand-up fight is good, but if you aren't playing with objectives or a type of mission, you're missing out. So a lot of what I discuss with deployment and where you go is under the assumption that you're not just shooting each other. If you aren't playing that way, I encourage you to check out some missions that do that. One way that I have found in the past that have helped bring people together to play games is to have a list of missions, usually 3 to 6, or excuse me, 3 or 6. And what we would do is we would list those off on a piece of paper, and we'd have mission or dice roll. If it's 6 missions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If it's 3 missions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you roll a dice, and you determine what mission type you play once you've made your force. That way, it makes your opponent play honest. If you only do stand-up fights, again, certain types of units, certain types of formations highly benefit from that, and they will struggle in a scenario that requires them to hold objectives or push a certain mission type or mission parameter. If you play where you're not sure what the mission is, especially in pickup games, you roll and you determine, you need to build your list ahead of time, and if you build a reasonably rounded list that will do good in all of those scenarios, you're going to have a reasonably good time. If you build a list that will only work really good in one of those scenarios, you have a very high probability of not getting that scenario and then just getting trounced. So it keeps you honest. It keeps you having to build a well-balanced list to play the scenarios and your opponent. That's also why when I do tournaments and I set up a tournament packet, I let people know what the missions are ahead of time so they can build a list that will encompass the ability to play all of them as best as possible, and B, it gets your opponents to design lists that will be reasonably good on all of those scenarios. If they favor one scenario over the others, they might be really good in that one mission, but might struggle in the others. So hopefully you guys will consider that approach. Now, back to parameter number 2. What is the mission? What are your parameters? What is it that you are doing to try to win? In this case on the table, I have a really basic scenario set up, just objective-wise. In Southern Assault 2022 and 2023, I think Bobby had a mission like this. These aren't placed with exact measurements. They're here just for an example. So on the table, we've got 3 orange or red, whatever it looks like to you, objectives that should be approximately on the middle line of the table. One in the center, and then these 2 that are probably like, I don't know, 12 to 18 inches or something away from each other. That's something about what Bobby would run. And in his scenario, it might have started on turn 2, maybe turn 1. The opponent who had more units within 3 inches or something like that, they get a point at the end of the turn for holding that objective, right? So I have determined where I'm deploying, the side that I have. I have looked for advantageous terrain setups. In this case, we've got some ruins here. We've got a variety of buildings. This ruin right here in the middle of the table is very advantageous for giving you some type of cover for being in it, depending on how you're treating it. I treat these ruins as trees, that type of cover, because I can't make trees out of MDF. So I've identified these things, and I see where the objectives are. So that's going to help me dictate where I want to set up. Now, I like to play with a lot of models. For this mock setup, I have 5 jade turkeys in the corner here. You can see them, and this may not be the most advantageous setup for them, but they're deployed in the corner over there as a star, ready to push forward and fight. This is an example of a list that, depending on the points we're playing, if they only brought the 5 models and maybe some battle armor, they're probably very elite pilots, very good at killing stuff. They don't have a lot of material for holding objectives. They've also offset on one side over there. Now, for deployment, obviously, if I have more models, we would be alternating deployment. But let's say, for the sake of the argument, you are seeing your opponent, and you can envision what they're going to do for their force because they're unlikely to split. And by the time they're done deploying, you see that over there. And then your deployment's happening somewhere on the table. When you see that, one of the considerations for you during your deployment is to ask yourself, can I fight that? If I allocate material to that side of the table, will I be able to outgun my opponent? Will it be an even trade? Will I lose that trade? Will I win that trade? And so forth. And depending on those answers is going to dictate where you start to place your forces. Now, let's say over there, if I'm playing the clanners, typically I want my last unit to be placed as best as possible, my Fire Moth. I want that one to be my trump card. It's got the highest mobility on my force, and based on what my opponent does, I'm going to place that on a flank if I can, come up behind them with battle armor. If they've got the flank guarded, I may deploy with my team, or may deploy in a strategic spot where I can zip around on an objective and my opponent might not catch them. But in this case, it's offset on one side, overloaded flank. And in this case, perhaps they drop the Mastercard or the Timberwolf first. Those are the heavy hitters for that list. And you're like, huh, okay, I've seen that. How much material would I need to invest to fight that force, right? So if you're not sure you can fight them in a stand-up fight because the flank is too strong, focus on the mission. The mission matters. You don't have to kill them to win the game. You just need to keep them off the objectives. In this particular case, when you're playing with objectives, you need to consider how you're going to get on them. Not only how you're going to fight the Jade Turkeys in the corner in this case, how are you going to win the objective? What are you going to do to get these? Because you know, in this setup, they're in the back corner. Their threat potential is mostly reserved to these two objectives. That Fire Moth could sprint, could cruise on over and get on this one, then he's by himself. If you position your forces in your deployment in such a way that if he runs over there, you can intercept. You can get him at short range and help offset that TMM and try and take him out, you can deny that objective. You start to consider what material you need to invest during deployment and where you need to move to help get those chess pieces lined up, those cogs and gears turning, so that you can try and leverage them to win the game or win the turn, win the momentum. With objectives like this, typically what I want to do is I want to rush forward and get on quick. I know I'm going to take some hits, I know I'm going to lose some material, but in this case, hopefully I've got a material advantage from the start over the clanners. I want to get on there, make them dig me out like a tick, right? That's what I want to do. So with them offset on a flank, I know they can only really threaten these efficiently because they only have 5 models in that corner. And then the only real threat to this one is probably the Fire Moth with its speed. Maybe the Pouncer after a turn or two, but the Fire Moth's the only one that can super duper threaten that. So where would I deploy in this situation? So we've discussed paying attention to the objectives. We've discussed offsetting your forces to determine if you can fight those. If I was deploying in this with objectives in this way, I personally think that deploying more central is important. So what does that look like? We're going to start off with a couple of models here. I'm going to grab some of my big boys, and we've got a Lance to start. And while we are grabbing, let's get the second Lance loaded up. We got our other Locust, our Phoenix Hawk, I think that's a Wasp, and we'll grab the Wraith. Okay. So usually when I play, we've got like a 10-inch deployment, so because I'm playing on a 4-foot by 4-foot table, so we've got our 10-inch deployment, right? So the first thing that I have dropped here is my Atlas. Why the Atlas first? He's slow as shit, and I need him to be central. I need him to be able to threaten the maximum amount of the table. So deploying that slow, heavy-hitting unit towards the middle somewhere is a good idea. Now I know with his movement, I've got a building here I can run to for cover. I've got these ruins over here, which we've mentioned that I treat as trees. So perhaps imagine this is a tree feature. I can run there to get some obscurity, increase his survivability. I have these buildings. I can divert over here if I need to, cruise around. I've got a variety of avenues that I can take him into. If I force him into a corner, I give myself only one option of a way to go. Straight forward or towards the center instead of having all of the options. Now, if you watched my video talking about threat projection, this is what I'm talking about. So he's should be roughly centered. He was almost exactly 24 inches in. The medium range is 24 inches. So from the edge of his base to the edge of the map, this goes off the edge because of the width of the base. Same thing over here, 24 inches, right? So as he pushes forward, 24 inches is almost already into my opponent's deployment zone. They're outside of 24. If they push up into this zone here, they're going to be a medium range. If they run up behind this building, okay, they're not shooting at me, I'm not shooting at them. They've offset for one objective, I've got 2. At the end of turn 1 or turn 2, if I'm holding 2 and they're holding 1, I'm up by 1 point. They got to fight and dig me out. They got to try and win. So as this Atlas pushes forward, I want him on that central objective because he can reach out and threaten so much stuff. Big bubble, 24 inches from the center here is essentially the whole table. He's got you at medium range is where he wants to be. He's got his TMM, he's got the +2 for being at medium range, and he wants to just obliterate with guns. Now, positioning-wise, the Jade Falcons can come up, use the cover, try and jump in, do stuff like that. But if you have leveraged your guns looking this direction, you're giving overlapping fields of fire. If you bait them in to shoot the Atlas and they invest a whole turn shooting at him, what did they invest to take him out or hurt him, and what do they lose to do it? So if I was continuing with my deployment here, the next thing that I would probably do, and this would vary based on what my opponent's doing, because I would probably, if I'm running 2 lances to their star, at some point I'm going to be deploying 2 units to their 1. But we've got our 10-inch deployment. We're going to drop the Annihilator. Something similar to the Atlas, have them roughly straddling that halfway mark. Why is the Annihilator important to be in the center? Same kind of thing I talked about with threat projection. This Annihilator is slow. If I put him in a back corner, let's say behind this mech hangar here, and then he has to walk around it, he's got a 4-inch move. That's 4. That's 4. That's 4. If he's not sprinting, and I want to be able to shoot, that's 3 turns for him to have gotten here, when I could have just deployed closer up, right? If I start him central, I don't have to worry about spending multiple turns to get towards the fight. I've already started at the maximum distance. Now, that's not always what you want to do, but with these slow units, that's very important. You want to be able to project their threat, bring their guns to bear. The units that sit back, that want to sit in a corner, that's usually your fast flankers who can leverage that speed to get in, like they're not hindered as much. If the Firemoth starts central here with a 20+ movement, it's not much different from being on a corner if he sprints, right? If that Firemoth variant's 20 speed and he sprints, he's got 30 movement. 30 from this corner versus 30 from the center, he's getting kind of where he wants to go, versus if the Annihilator sprints, he moves 6 instead of 4. It doesn't make sense. So your slow units being central, and that way they can respond to what your opponent does, and they're already kind of central to the battle, and they can divert as needed. If I am the Highlander here, I deploy an Annihilator early on during the deployment phase over here. Let's say that I take my 2 big boys, my Annihilator and my Atlas, and I offset them on a flank. I overload the flank with that firepower and that material. If I'm the Jade Falcon player, I'm also going through these same considerations, these same questions. And then I go, okay, what does my opponent put in that corner? If I want to push for that flank, can I do it? Can I fight it? Can I outshoot them? How much material will it take to take those units down? And based on those parameters, for me, if early on, let's say, second deployment, third deployment, whatever it is, I have to drop 2 units, I drop that Atlas and the Annihilator on the corner thinking I'm going to be cheeky and overwatch that objective. As the Jade Falcon, I'll just forget this side. I don't care anymore. I will fight for these 2 objectives. And I will force them to push up to that one and this one, and they're so slow that there's multiple turns that they aren't going to have their guns in optimum position. If I'm able to push this flank and deny my opponent being able to use all of their guns to shoot at me, I have leveraged my force versus theirs in a positive direction. So let's say, mathematically, let's say we're playing a 300-point game. I'm not sure what this is because I just grabbed models. Let's say it's 300 points, right? Let's say this Annihilator's like 40. Let's say this Atlas is 60, right? That seems probably somewhere in there. It's probably more like 45, 55, but whatever. Approximately a third of my force, so 100 points, is in these 2 models, okay? I put them in a corner, and then I play with the rest of my models, the other 6, more central. My opponent sees me place these in the corner, and it does what I would do. Alternate, Justin. What would we do? So I put them in the corner, opposite these, because I don't want to fight them now. I've taken them out of the fight. Now my 300 points of Jade Turkeys is fighting 200 points of Northwind Highlanders for a couple of turns. I have 33% more material to fight yours, and you have 33% less than I have to fight back with, until these guys get into the fight. If I can leverage denying them a couple of turns of shooting by taking out some of your units, by the time they get to the fight, perhaps I've still got the material advantage. That's exactly what I was talking about when we were considering the Jade Falcons being in the corner and where I would deploy my Highlanders. If I deploy right in front of them, I have to go fight them. If I ignore them, I can push for objectives and make them come to me, hopefully trickle in, and leverage that offset in positioning to have more points, more material, more shots at their units than they have to return at me. The terrain and positioning is important, but at the beginning of the battle, the deployment is going to dictate where you can go to bring those guns to bear, how you can leverage your points versus their points. So, for this right here, if we're continuing forward, I'm probably going to continue with a more central deployment with my slower units. So I'm going to grab that Warhammer. He's a little faster than them, but still got a lot of damage. We've got our Blackjack here, probably same kind of thing, going to overload there. Now here's where things might get a little bit different. So my opponent sees this, we're seeing where they're going to deploy. Now I have to consider what I want to do with the remaining forces that I have. My Locust, my Phoenix Hawk, my Wasp, and my Wraith. If I'm running a fire moth or something like that as a clanner, I might want to be off on the side so that I can go, okay, turn 1, I've deployed 10, I got a 20-inch move, I'm going to sprint, I'm going to run behind someone. Or I'm going to do a standard move, run behind someone, drop battle armor. Run to objective, drop battle armor. From the central location, I have good threats, right? Or good threat projection. I can put my forces where I want them to be. So in this case, if my locust is more central, he's got, I think, a 20 move, give or take. So roughly 20 there. And give or take, I could probably get within 3 of this objective. Could definitely get on that one. So my locust kind of being somewhere central makes a lot of sense. I can use the locust as the pawn who has to divert. Is that fire moth going to go over here? If so, my locust can go to match it to try and deny the objective. But I have to consider, okay, if that fire moth is going to go for one of these objectives, which one do I think is going to go for him? How much material do I have to invest to try and stop him? Then I determine where I want these to go. So perhaps I want to bring maybe my Wraith offset on the left, right? Because that's going to give him a little bit more of a threat over this objective. And this one, I don't necessarily have to worry as much about this. And perhaps over here is where I get a little cheeky, right? I know I've got enough material to push the middle. I know that I've got some guys to potentially threaten over here if that fire moth decides he wants to be cheeky and cruise over and try and get the objective. But now I have to determine early on if I want to get the lead on the objectives, what's my opponent going to do? Are they going to throw that fire moth in? Are they going to run some units? Because the clanner units are pretty speedy over there. You got like 10 and 12s on stuff. The Massacre is a 6 or an 8, something like that. So like they got a little speed. My dudes are a little slower, but I can get the central objective because they offset. I know I can run up to that objective. I can sprint. I can give up shooting for a turn if I need to get on the objective, depending on what turn you start scoring. But I'm thinking maybe they go. My opponent goes, okay, that fire moth doesn't want to go here because he's noted my positioning. He's like, okay, that locust can intercept me here. That wraith can intercept me here. That blackjack can jump and intercept me here. The big guys are going to have a harder time getting to me. They're going to be firing through terrain, going to get cover. Big guy's probably going to go there. I don't want to bring that fire moth over here because I think he's going to get shot. He's by himself. That's a good idea. Now, based on my movement during the first few turns, if I overload that flank and they see that fire moth has that position, because generally as a clanner, I'm trying to go last with my lights as much as possible. They are the tip of a spear, so to speak, or dagger in the back of an opponent. They are the one that gives you maximum versatility on positioning, threatening objectives, getting battle armor into position, right? So if I was to load all my units towards this direction to ignore that objective, and my opponent gets a later turn on the fire moth, they may take the math and go, okay, Justin's moved a bunch of units here, he only has this, and this left to go, he may not be able to get into short range of my fire moth can get on this objective, statistically probably weathers the fire, maybe takes a damage, maybe my battle armor I'm carrying takes a damage, I get a point for the turn, next turn I can retreat off of it, I've got the lead, right? So there is some consideration on what you move after the deployment, but I'm positioned in a reasonable way to try and intercept him. So what do I do with the last two guys? For the last two guys, I could continue to load up on the middle, I could continue to push over there, but because I've got a Phoenix Hawk and I've got a Stinger here, I might want to see about doing a little Operation Jump, right? So over here on this objective, we've got a 10-inch deployment. I need to be within 3 of the objective, which is approximately this door. 10 inches is here. I think the Phoenix Hawk's got like a 12-inch jump, right? So perhaps my Phoenix Hawk deploys on the flank facing the Falcons, right? And perhaps my Stinger does something similar, right? This comes back to the conversation for the video I put out recently talking about jumping. Why would you jump? What would you do? Part of that discussion was about leveraging your TMM for an objective, right? Now, turn 1, perhaps I think, okay, maybe my opponent diverts over because they want to shoot at me, and I want to put maximum material on the objectives and make them make choices on what they shoot. If I think they're going to try and shoot this objective, I could ignore it if I want to. If I see them move and I think they're going to go over here, cool, you know. So, point is, turn 1, I could take a jump maneuver with my Phoenix Hawk, land here, my Stinger can land here. I've now got 2 units on the objective with TMM bonuses from jumping, and now my opponent has to clear 2 units in 1 turn to be able to get that objective, to get that point, right? So, now that we're deployed, we've taken a bunch of considerations into what I would do. Recapping. What does the table look like? What side are you on? Are there any strategic terrain features that are going to be advantageous for you? Boom. Okay. What is the mission type? Where do I need to deploy my units to potentially A, use those terrain features, and B, have maximum threat projection on those objectives? Second consideration. And 3, as my opponent's deploying, where do I need to go? In this case, I went more central, and in general, this is probably the best positioning, usually, not always, but usually. I have maximum threat projection on 3 objectives. If I am particularly worried as we start the game about those Jade Falcons and I see them start to push this flank and they're all coming here and they leverage trying to get that one objective, ignore it. You can totally ignore that objective and I push these 2. And they now have to dig me off 2 objectives at some point to try and get an edge. And if they can't, that disparity goes from I get 2 points, they get 1. I get 2, they get 1. I get 2, so I'm at 6, they get 1, 3. Every turn that's compounding, and they have to continue trying to clear me off objectives at some point to get the edge, to get the turn, to get the tide in their favor, to get that momentum. And with them having less forces in this case, anything they lose makes it so much harder. Because they offset on that flank, it gives me an advantage to choose where I want to go. If I see them move that way, I can push all 3. If I see them push this one, I can use the terrain features and divert. And in this case, I've got my my Wasp or Stinger, whatever it says, I get them confused, and the Phoenix Hawk right here to threaten, and like psychologically give my opponent the idea that I might go for that objective. I'm waiting, much like I talked about the Clanners, I'm going to try and wait for that Fire Moth to go last, right, for me, because I want to maximum threat projection on where I want to go. I want to scare my opponent into positioning or making a misplay because Fire Moth behind you is scary, Battle Armor behind you is scary. What is my opponent going to do? Now I'm going to strike. Do I want the dagger in the back? Do I want the battle armor deployment in the back? Do I want to go to an objective? Do I want to go to an objective and drop the battle armor so now they have 2 units they have to clear? What do I want to do? So in this case, as the Northwood Highlander player that I am currently, I have threatened this objective. My Jade Falcon player over here, the mythical, or the made-up, make-believe version of Justin, that guy, this guy, the dude over there, he's got to make choices. So this could play out a variety of different ways. These dudes can do what the Fire Moth would do. So based on what my opponent's doing, I'm going to try and wait and move these probably last. Not always, but probably. Because based on where they go is going to dictate where I want these to go. There are some times, though, I won't do that. There are sometimes I want to bait my opponent into shoving for an objective. Sometimes I'm willing to trade a high pilot skill, Stinger or Wasp, whatever this is, that's pilot skill 7 and worth not many points. Sometimes I'm willing to jump in and get the TMM bonus and overload an objective and get my opponent thinking, okay, do I want to shoot that? Do I want to deny him a point? All of the shots that they're making into that are shots not going into these 2 objectives, okay? So taking into consideration what they do and where your units want to go, and kind of feeling out your opponent, seeing what they're doing, and what you might be able to bait them into, kind of a trap. So, hypothetically, they overload this objective. I don't want to bait them out because I can't withstand 5 guys shooting. Maybe I could withstand 2 or 3. These guys just, boom, they run towards the middle. They do a sprint move or they jump, whatever. They can collapse in and overload the objectives I know that I can control, that my opponent does not have much agency over, right? But if my opponent shoves over this way, perhaps they want to get like vantage points looking at this objective or this one over here, and they only leave a couple dudes looking at this one, I might absolutely throw these over because I can bait those shots in and make them have to deal with me. So what we've currently got here, if we were to quantify it, or not quantify it, if we were to, some nomenclature, is that right? If we were to name it, a more central or castle deployment is kind of what I would call this one, and castling can be interpreted a variety of ways. It's like all your forces being together, but I like to think of the castle being the central deployment, the optimum position to give you the most versatility on intercepting or responding to how your opponent is positioning. And then you have overloaded flanks, and then you have actual like flankers. So in this case, castle, central deployment, the Jade Falcons did an overloaded flank, which sometimes works. In this case, I would say no because of the objectives. But when would that work? When would that work? So if I'm deploying first, much like I talked about with putting the Annihilator and the Atlas in a corner and my opponent going over and ignoring them, I might also say, okay, I don't want to deploy my Atlas and my Annihilator first. I want to take my Phoenix Hawk, my Stinger, and I'm gonna put it on the corner, on the side here, overlooking that objective. You know, my opponent goes, okay, I see that, they place a unit. And then I go, okay, I'm gonna take my Locust, so I'm gonna put it over here in the corner, right? So my opponent's like, okay. And then I take my Wraith, put it in the corner. My opponent's like, oh crap, they got 4 units over there. And they start to think, if you know, this is where, to take a term from a guy I used to watch a lot for 40K, Fritz 40K, back when his channel was Way of Sam Han. he uses the term tricknology. You know, like how are you going to psychologically get your opponent to do something, trick them into something? Not necessarily trying to like deceive them with something super like sneaky and evil, but like trying to play that strategy game and you know, get it in that way. So if you're overloading a flank, this is the way it looks for me. I start placing those units and I start to pay attention to what my opponent does. Do they see me drop these these units over here, and do they respond in kind? Do they want to take the fight? Do they go, okay, I want that fight? Okay. If they do, I can bait them into deploying units, and in this case, one thing you'll notice, I put fast units first. Usually I'd like to deploy my Fire Moth last, but in this case, maybe I bait out early. I bait out that unit so they could see, and they're like, okay, I don't want that Locust to get this flank, I'll deny them. I don't want these dudes to push an objective, I'll deny them, and start throwing units. And then I go, okay, they've overloaded a bunch of material to match my overload. Now I'm going to put the rest of my stuff central. Now I'm going to put a bunch of stuff over here. With these fast units off in the corner, if I'm able to bait my opponent into trying to match my deployment because they want to fight it, I can take these fast ones and I can go and buy and go to the middle. I can take these dudes, push to the middle of the side, or I've overloaded a little bit here so I can sprint to the objectives. I can bait the deployment there to get maximum points on a corner and then totally ignore that flank and leave those guys with nothing to shoot, so that I'm able to take my points to A, earn objectives, earn victory points, and B, leverage my points at whatever they didn't deploy there. And if they deployed everything there, all 5 of those clan mechs versus these 4, and I ignore them and shove to the middle and the side, now they got to traverse the whole map. Now they got multiple turns. I'm probably, statistically, going to get up on a couple of turns of points, and now they have to, the onus is on them to clear me off objectives and get the lead. And one of the things that, the way that this might look, they deploy there, we push forward and we get this objective, right? So we're over here, let's say the Warhammer and the Blackjack have made it over here, and these dudes have ignored the fight, they've pushed over. So something like that, right? And then our Jade Falcons have pushed forward, and perhaps the Massacari ends up over here because he wants some cover, he wants to be able to shoot. And then our Pouncer has made it over here, our Fire Moth's made it over here, they want the objective. Our Mad Cat is over here because he wants to fire, and our Nova has pushed forward because he's wanting the objective. Now this may not be the most optimum setup, I'm just quick thinking on what you might want to do. Also, there's no cover for the Mad Cat, so I wasn't looking, but he would probably offset so that part of his body is behind the building or the Quonset hut to get cover. Just imagine that's what he's doing. They want to sit over here, so that Massacre's like, okay, I got the Atlas, the Mad Cat's, I got the Atlas, I got the Annihilator, I can shoot stuff, we've got an objective, we've got 1 point. Turn ends, we've exchanged fire, whatever happens, I get a point here, I get a point here, that's 2. They get a point here, that's 1, okay? We go into the next turn, all this material pushes forward. You know, these dudes push forward. You know, we start to do a little shimmy shift, you know, something like this. You know, maybe these guys push forward, they want to shoot. They sit back with the Black Hawk, who's getting a little sneaky. The Fire Moth tries to come over behind and shoot. And if I start to see the movement go this way, I may have just been like, okay, my Phoenix Hawk jumps here behind him to deny or contest an objective, which is even worse. I'm already up by 1, so we're 2-1. That Phoenix Hawk gets over there. At the end of this turn, if they don't clear me, I go up by 2, they go up by 0. We're 4-1 because my fast units. So that might look something like this. Maybe the Locust sprints over the Phoenix Hawk instead of moving where he did. Maybe he jumps over on the objective. Maybe the Massacre and the Mad Cat have to shoot to clear him. They have to clear 2 just to maintain that 1 point, right? So, but let's assume that I didn't do that. And I'm just going through like how the turns may play out with the deployment. They've started to come in, they've pushed in, but they don't have a lot of material in this fight, right? So we exchange fire, things may die, things may not. This Fire Moth might die this turn, might not. A variety of the units can see him. Let's say I get the lead though. You know, we're not going to worry about what died, but we get the lead, and this is what can happen. You know, now we're on like going in like turn 3. I'm sitting on that objective. We're up 4-2. Let's say I didn't deny that we're up 4-2, right? So my Warhammer moves over. We want to get some vision, more stuff to shoot. Get our team in. Wraith moves over. You can totally, to get better positioning now, because I'm up, the onus is on the Jade Falcon player to try and clear me, to get objectives. They have to get ahead now. There's multiple turns they now have to score on. I can actually back off and retreat from this objective. I can force them into the meat grinder. They have to get ahead. I now have the momentum. I don't have to hold that objective anymore. I can back off of it. I can get better positioning. I can hide behind terrain, behind buildings, you know, whatever it is that I want to do. And they have to come to me because I have the momentum. I have the score. If neither one of us get this point, at this point we're up 4-2. Now it's 5-3, right? That's where we're currently at. So I can back up and force them into the kill box, and they have so much further to go, right? And I've already got up on material. This wouldn't have been as easy if these dudes were here. If I started on a flank with all of my models turtled up, I'm on this objective, and now it's multiple turns to get to this one, and if they had deployed central, they put the fire moth over here, they push to this objective if that's what happens, right? And now it's 1-2, right? That could happen, and that's not good either. And then they could do the same thing, right? So let's say that I overloaded a flank with my whole force, I push forward, and my stuff is more sitting back here right now, right? And we're on that objective, and I've pushed this side of the city, and the Jade Falcons were much more aggressive. They have the Fire Moth here, the Black Hawk is already in. Let's say the Massacre deployed more central, so he's pushed up over here, getting a little bit of cover. Same thing with the Mad Cat, right? So my Pouncer, my Black Hawk, they both have really good, reasonable TMMs. They've jumped, you know, because maybe I don't want to shoot. Maybe I want to leverage that TMM to hold the center objective and make these Northern Highlanders shoot me. If they don't kill all of them, I get a point. That Fire Moth here, point. There, point. 1-2, okay? If the tide starts to turn, the Jade Falcons can do some more jumping shenanigans to hold the objective. Mad Cat might fall off the objective to get a better vantage point. Same thing with the Massacre. I'm up a point. You know, 1-2, right? I can determine what I want to do with that Fire Moth now. Do I want to keep it going where it's like 2-4 and it's 3-6? Or do I want to keep the 1 point lead and make my opponent come after me? Like, make them fight for it. If I can keep their light mechs from being able to get to my rear, that Fire Moth can retreat off of that, leave the point, and push forward to get behind someone. Drop, go in the backfield if someone's got a tank or something, drop the battle armor behind him, go behind a indirect fire archer or something, start shooting him in the butt, harass him, because your opponent now has to fight to get ahead. So much like in the previous example where the Northern Highlanders might take the center, get ahead by a turn or two in points, and then fall back, strategically reposition for better vantage points, and make the opponent come into the meat grinder. Because if they don't, if your opponent does not push forward for that objective, they'll lose the game, unless they can table you, and then have enough time to get the objectives by the end of the game. You have taken that momentum. It's the example that I gave in, I believe, the video talking about threat projection was like football. If you get ahead, and then you get the ball back, you can run it as long as you can get your first downs and keep that momentum, keep the strategy, keep moving where you need to go. You can grind the clock down and win the game. Now, I'm not saying you want to be slow and boring in the game, but it's up to the opponent to come to you to win it. There's no reason for you to be overly aggressive and lose the game. Get your points and play strategic. And in this case, the Jade Falcons, and I don't know how this list would play out, what the points would actually be. This is why I like Inner Sphere for Alpha Strike in particular. You have a lot more models to play with. It is a quantity versus quality equation, and quantity can be a quality all its own. It is also why when I have played Clanners at Southern Assault, and when I played my Wolves Dragoons at Southern Assault 2023, I still tried to have a certain number of units. I did worse this last year with my Wolves Dragoons because I only had 8 mechs and 2 battle armor, so 10 activations, sort of. The battle armor sometimes are. Versus my clan list from 2022 had 10 mechs, 2 battle armor, which is 12 activations, sort of, because of battle armor, but that extra 2 is massive, right? And it's much like I discussed with having a high pilot skill jump mech or something that's not going to do much. It's still a pawn. It can still score an objective just as easy as someone else. It just can't hit stuff as easy, but they can't ignore it. It will score you a point. In this case, they have quality versus quantity, so it's a lot harder for the clanners to do this, which in the fluff and the lore, this is a case. This happens to them. I mean, Comstar did this to them. Logistics is an issue. They have better mechs and better pilots. We have more shit, right? But in this case, the strategy and the philosophy still holds true. If I was playing the Jade Falcons in this case, being more centrally deployed in this example is imperative. My units have a better TMM. I have better speed. The table setup was more for aesthetics. There's a lot more over here for the Northern Highlanders than there were the Jade Falcons. I probably deployed more buildings there just to be fair. But a more central deployment so that I can do vert based on what my opponent does. And if I was to alternate or deviate a little bit from that, later on I might take that Fire Moth to do like what I said with the Wasp or Sting or whatever that is and the Phoenix Hawk off on a flank. I might do that with the Fire Moth so that I can force or run around them and flank. And I might also consider doing the fire moth early to get my opponent to try and intercept, and the fire moth so fast I can just whoop, regroup with my forces and divert from there. That said, folks, I think I have beaten this deployment horse about to death. If you have any questions, concerns, thoughts, things that you do, considerations you have, or questions for me, perhaps an example of, this is what I went through, Justin, how would you have deployed, that might be really good to get me going. Either that'll be a text response that I can give you, or maybe a follow-up video, because this is just quick thoughts on things that go through my brain, considerations when I set up for a game, whether it's a tournament or casual play. Still consider all of these things. But it will vary based on scenarios. This one's just a real quick example of something we did at Southern Assault. There are a few other examples of things that Bobby ran. I don't want to go through all those missions, but the overall considerations and philosophies are very similar on most of them. The one objective or mission type that I don't like to play is capture flag. I think it's stupid. With the current mechanics, the way you pick up the flag, that's why. Modified rules for that, it works just fine. But yeah, if you have any thoughts, concerns, questions, anything at all, sound off in the comments below. If you think I'm a complete moron, it's also cool for you to say that too. But yeah, if you're new here, I hope you enjoyed this video. Hit that like and subscribe. Share with your friends. We're trying to get this channel going, this channel popping. And as we move forward through the year, based on channel growth, we may consider reusing my old Discord, getting it going. We may talk about Patreon, and I've got some thoughts on a website thing that I might want to do. We'll see if we do that, and if I'm able to keep up. If I do the website thing, it's because I want to do something that helps promote the narrative side of playing games. In particular, I would like to pair that with Patreon, maybe, and have like named pilots based on Patreon supporters and play narrative story-driven games, however that might look, and have them show up, have a pilot card and the mech and whatever that they're using, and have a story-driven thing and not just random games. I like random games too, but I think if we had some narrative campaign games going where viewers and Patreon supporters, Discord members are like, hey, that's me, that's the mech, Justin put me in it, I'm piloting it, oh crap, I got blown up, or like I rolled a crit and hit the snake eyes and blew someone up. Like, that kind of thing's fun, and it gets people involved and invested, and that's a consideration. I don't know if that'll happen, but we'll see. I digress though. I started rambling, as you guys know I like to do, and if I don't sign off here, I'll find something to ramble about. So with that being said, I think it is time to go. As always, thank you guys for watching. Thank you for hanging out. Really do appreciate it. If you want to help support what I do, check out Death Resigns. Supporting them helps support my day job, which helps let me continue to do what I do. If you're looking for anything Battletech related at all, check out Fortress Miniatures and Games. This will be a pop-up on either side here. Bobby is taking to sponsoring the channel. Really cool dude. And help support him. Also help support me too. And he's got a lot of cool Battletech stuff. On that note, thank you guys for hanging out with me today. I really do appreciate being able to ramble. I hope that this reaches some new players and gets you interested in Battletech Alpha Strike. That's what I'd like to do, that beacon of the light for the community, to try and bring in new viewers and give the existing vets and Battletech players something to listen to and get the juices flowing, the gears turning for Battletech. On that note, guys, keep rolling those dice, keep painting your models, and I will catch you guys next time.